Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the webinar launch for continued access to investigational products, guiding equitable and fair decisions. My name is Sarah White. I'm the Executive Director at the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard, and I'm delighted to begin this webinar launch. Before we start, we have just a few disclaimer slides. The opinions contained on today's slides from the authors and the presenters are not intended to represent positions of Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard. The MRCT Center is supported by voluntary contributions from foundations, corporations, international organizations, academic organizations, government entities, and as well as by grants. The center is committed to the autonomy in our research and to the transparency in our relationships. And the center and its directors retain the responsibility for final control of the content of any of the products, results, and deliverables. Next slide, please. In addition, Ben Rotz is an employee of Eli Lilly and Company, and Carla Childers is an employee of Johnson & Johnson, and they too, their opinions are their own and not intended to represent positions of Eli Lilly and Company or Johnson & Johnson. Next slide, please. So welcome everybody to today's webinar. A few tips to enjoy the session. You can use the Q&A for your questions, and we'll do our best to answer them live. There is a closed captioning available in the Zoom toolbar that you can use. And as we describe today's resources, we'll be dropping those links into the chat for you all to be able to access. And yes, absolutely, the recording slides and any additional materials will be available next week. Next slide, please. So for those of you who are not familiar with the MRCT Center, we are a research and policy center focused on addressing the conduct, ethics, oversight, and regulatory environment of global clinical trials. Our mission is to improve the integrity, safety, and rigor of those global clinical trials. And we do that by engaging a diverse group of stakeholders, including industry, academia, government, nonprofit organizations, and patient advocates, to really define and understand the emerging issues in global clinical trials. And then we intentionally and mindfully create and implement ethical, actionable, and practical solutions. The MRCT Center has been around since 2009. All of our resources are openly and freely available on our website, and you can see the link at the bottom of the slide now. Next slide, please. I am thrilled to be joined by three experts in the field of post-trial continued access. We're all going to be kind of talking in somewhat of an organic fashion today. So I'm going to briefly mention who is on the call with us today, and when they talk, they'll be introducing themselves. So I'm thrilled to have Carla Childers, Vice President for Bioethics Policy and Partnership in the Office of the Chief Medical Officer at Johnson & Johnson, Brandy Ellis, Lived Experience Advocate, and Ben Rotz, Associate Vice President for Global Medical Policy Strategy and Operations at Eli Lilly and Company. Next slide, please. We have a packed hour for this audience today. The content of today's presentation is going to begin with the introduction of a case study. And this is really meant to get you all thinking about the complexities of post-trial continued access. Then we'll move to talk about the MRCT Center's project and available resources. Then we're going to come back to that case and we're going to unpack the complexities. And we should have time at the end for Q&A. So make sure you put those questions in the Q&A. So without delay, I'm going to turn it over to Carla to introduce that case. Carla, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And just brief introduction of myself. As Sarah mentioned, I head up bioethics policy and partnerships in the Office of the Chief Medical Officer at J&J. And as part of that responsibility, I chair the internal bioethics committee and have responsibility for education work and various aspects. But the hat I'm wearing today is more of my policy hat, and I've been the co-lead with Sarah and colleagues for the last couple of years. And post-trial access is a passion of mine, and the topic is a passion of mine. So really excited to be here. And what I want to do is maybe give you a little bit of a prompt to give you a sense of the complexity, because in this policy space, we have examples where things are very clear, where we have a very clear life-threatening illness and the individual is going to face likely mortality if they don't receive access, all the way over to things that are very benign, where there are many things on the market and an individual has a mild condition and can be safely transitioned. The really nitty gritty challenging ones are what we found are in the middle. And we kind of want to just give you a brain teaser to kind of think about as we go through these next several slides. This is completely made up. This is not based on any company's product situation, but what it is an amalgam of the lot of different issues we've experienced. So please take it in the spirit. So you can read on the screen, but I'll maybe hit some highlights for you. And imagine you're on a team, and this is typical. We have project teams that are working on developing important therapies, and they're thinking about the potential to provide post-trial continued access for an investigational product that's treating a common but difficult to treat gastrointestinal condition. And they've made it to a phase 3 trial. So they obviously have gone through safety. They've got the demonstration that they need of proof of concept, and now they're really honing in on that registrational data. There are a few therapies on the market globally, but patient response varies, and this is not uncommon, especially in many of these immune modulated or these GI type conditions. Once a patient's stable on treatment, standard medical practice is to maintain that therapy until the patient progresses, and so not disrupting their therapy. Symptoms aren't life-threatening, but they can be really difficult to manage and have an impact on an individual's quality of life. And while not mortality, it could affect their ability to show up to work or to care for others or really to lead a quality-filled, healthy life. So at the start of the trial, the team is reviewing the company's internal policies, and they did a landscape of the available alternative therapies. And they've concluded that based on all of this information, continued access after the trial should be provided if the product demonstrates that there is a benefit to patients. And probably what's missing here also is a favorable risk-benefit profile. The mechanism that they plan to provide might be an extension trial, but they're also evaluating local programs that permit the administration of an investigational product and what those pathways might look like. So the team is getting to the end of the trial. They're doing their first primary readout, and they actually see that the primary endpoint has not been met. But upon further analysis of the data, they realize that a subpopulation of the trial is actually responding positively. So I will leave you there with that cliffhanger. We will come back to the case study later on, but just kind of have some of the tensions that this brings to mind in your mind as we go through these next few slides. Thanks, Sarah. I believe I'm throwing it back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Carla. And let's go. Let everyone hold that in your heads because we'll come back to it. But Kristen, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the MRCT Center's task force and the deliverables, and this will then lead us back to unpacking the complexities of that case. So first things first, let's start with the definition of continued access as defined by the task force. We took a mindful approach to say the continued provision of the investigational medicine or continued maintenance of the investigational significant risk device for any clinical trial participant after participation in the trial. Continued access applies to medicines that are drugs or biologics and excludes vaccines. Some investigational interventions may require unique supportive care, and that should be considered by the sponsor, researcher, health system, or host country government. Post-trial continued access is a shared responsibility and should be determined before the trial begins. Let's go to the next slide. We'll provide a little bit of a historical background to the MRCT Center's involvement in post-trial continued access. The center first took on this topic in 2015 with an original work group. That work group took an ethical and a practical approach to the shared responsibilities of continued access. And in 2017, published the original principles, guidance document, and toolkit. That work was used and embedded in organizational policies and procedures. And if we go to the next slide, fast forward 5 years to 2022, we heard from you, we heard from our communities, and we understood in conversation and collaboration with our executive and steering committee organizations that the original work had been pressure tested. There were emerging challenges in this space, and there was more work to do. So in 2022, we began talking to subject matter experts, and we convened the PTR task force to update this work. This group mindfully defined kind of three big buckets that we were going to work on. We wanted to improve what was already available. We wanted to take on devices, and we wanted to assess the heightened challenges of post-trial continued access in lower and middle income countries. Let's go to the next slide. So a year later, we developed and published a revised set of principles and we published a revised set of principles with an associated analysis and also a framework of responsibilities for investigational medicines. And we're going to look at those tools in just a minute. But if we go to the next slide, the following year, we intentionally turned our attention to devices. And with the help of a group of medtech and device experts, we tackled the specific challenges of post-trial continued maintenance to investigational significant risk devices. And we have a framework for that as well. If we go to the next slide, earlier this year in 2025, the task force began to focus on the challenges of continued access in lower middle income countries, and that work is still ongoing. If we go to the next slide, I'd just like to take a moment to recognize and thank the task force members and the device experts, many of whom were on the webinar today. This is an incredibly dedicated and knowledgeable group, just really great to work with. This work that you're seeing would not have been done without the group. And before I go to the resources, as we prepare for this webinar, you sit back and you really think about what progress did we make? And I'd really like to highlight that the important progress that this group made is the how. Post-trial continued access was and is recognized in the Declaration of Helsinki and in other ethical guidelines. So the group had a solid foundation of principles and interdependent criteria to start from. But how this task force really moved the needle was focusing on the really difficult work of how. And when we get back to the case, you're going to see that the how is not always straightforward. So they focused on how to implement the principles, how to operationalize the planning for post-trial continued access. And I think, and I hope this is really going to have tremendous impact for organizations. So while I say that, I would really like to turn to Brandy Ellis, who has lived experience in this area, and really ask her to comment on what she sees the importance of this work from her perspective. So Brandy, can I turn it over to you?
Absolutely. So, hello, my name is Brandy Ellis. I am not currently under any trial patient consent. I do have a day job, but I do now occasionally get paid for my lived experience advocacy work. So, when I enrolled in a deep brain stimulation trial 14 years ago, I had no idea if it would work. Like many participants, I would have signed almost anything because there were no alternatives. What I didn't fully understand then, and what usually remains unresolved today, is what should happen after the trial ends. I live with that reality every day. My device absolutely keeps me well, but it's still not FDA approved. I am no longer a trial subject, but I can't rely on insurance coverage in the United States. That means I don't have a guarantee that when my battery needs replacement or if anything else goes wrong, that I will have care available or accessible. Um, and to be clear, if I lose this device, I will get sick again. I am incredibly fortunate. I have an ethical and supportive study team who remain in my life. And through my advocacy work, they now treat me as a colleague. But that is unusual, and most participants are not so lucky. They face the uncertainty of being left without access once a trial concludes, even when their health depends on the investigational product. I do recognize the business challenges. When a product's path to market is uncertain, it's difficult to promise lifetime access. But I strongly believe that asking participants to consent to explantation or accept the risk of abandonment should never be the default solution, especially to avoid having to provide continued access. People like me make commercial progress possible. Without participants, there is no trial, there is no data, and ultimately no path to approval. So I consider a core ethical issue here the uncertainty. Trial participants commit without knowing the outcome. But the institutions and the sponsors do know one thing for certain. Their interventions change lives. With that comes a responsibility to ensure that those who helped make the future treatments possible are not left behind. And that's why post-trial access matters. And that's why I do this advocacy work. It's not about doing participants a favor. It's about honoring the ethical obligations to support the very people who make research and innovation possible. Thanks.
Thanks, Brandy. We're really, really lucky to have you on this work group, and you keep us grounded, and it's thank you. And now it's hard to bring the slides back up and follow you again, but that's what we're going to keep going with this. So the slide you're looking at now is our project's landing page on our website. And as I mentioned before, the resources are all freely and openly available. And Kaylee has provided the links that you can use, or you can navigate from our you can navigate from the homepage of our website. Let's go to the next slide. You're going to see one of our foundational images for this task force, and it illustrates the shared responsibility of continued access from clinical trials through general access. And as a group, we spent a lot of time thinking and focusing on the planning for and the continued assessment and reassessment of the decision to provide continued access. And if you look at this screen, and I know there's a lot of words, but hopefully this will tempt you to go to the website and really study this figure. On the left, you'll see the sponsor does much of that early planning and assessment at the program level. But you can see here that the investigator plays a pivotal role, kind of in the middle here, of evaluating and determining the individual benefit of continued access and providing that continued access after the clinical trial. When the product is reasonably available, that shared responsibility moves to the local healthcare system. It seems straightforward. In reality, it's not. When you get into the weeds and these complexities and where Carla is going to go in a few minutes, it's not. And I'd like to turn to Ben for some perspective here. And Ben, can you reflect on the shared responsibilities and these critical points of transition?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And hello, everybody. I'm Ben Rhodes. I work at Eli Lilly and Company. I'm Associate Vice President of Global Medical Policy. And One of the areas in which I have policy responsibilities is pre-approval access, which includes the post-trial access space. Um, and and it is very important to consider this shared responsibility because this is a fantastic ideal situation, the one we all hope happens, that we're coming up with new and potentially better life-saving treatments that make it to market and are accessible for the patients in a broad sense. That's the reason why we do our medicine development and device development, and it's to improve patient lives. But it doesn't always happen that way. And we have situations, as you can see, this continued reassessment here in the middle, where you do have to look at what has happened in the development. Maybe Carla talked about our scenario. Maybe you don't have something that makes it all the way to market. Maybe you have something where the research is still ongoing, and you need to do an assessment, but standard of care has changed, and there are suitable alternative treatments that are now available in the market, and it would be appropriate to transition patients to that. But the one thing that I do want to emphasize overall, which has been an important topic for us from a post-trial access space, is this mindset of in post-trial access, you are done with the trial. You have switched from research and you are now dealing with treatment. And we have to think about sometimes that first patient that completes their research period may be done before you have the trial results, depending on the trial design, and you've moved it to post-trial access. So you do also have to have that continuous assessment as to what's best for those patients, and what's going to happen at the end of the trial. There's a lot of differences that happen. Uh, Overall, towards the end of this continuum, if there are suitable alternative treatments available, that's where it becomes investigator responsibility, provider responsibilities to figure out what is the best way to transition those patients and move them into normal clinical care. Because ultimately, that is what's best for all in the research enterprise.
Thanks, Ben.
Mhm.
Okay, let's go. We have a couple slides about the resources, and then we're going to go back to that case that we keep talking about. Um, So you're seeing a screenshot of the principles. These principles have remained largely the same with some minor modifications since 2017. As I mentioned before, they reflect this shared responsibility and actions to provide continued access. And the principles are now accompanied by an analysis that show how to implement the principles. And there's 12. They should be read as a whole. Let's go to the next slide. So I mentioned the current task force understood that operationalizing the principles was an area that needed work. So really thinking about how do you do this? And in response, um, the group developed two frameworks. One for investigational medicine, so operationalizing access to investigational medicines, and one for operationalizing the continued maintenance of investigational significant risk devices. These frameworks were set up by milestones of the product development, and they provide a list of considerations and questions meant to objectively guide responsible decisions about continued access. Let's go to the next slide. One of the important components in the framework is this list of interdependent criteria. This is a set of criteria that organizations can use in the assessment, planning, and reassessment of post-trial continued access. It's generally it's generally part of the policies and procedures, and organizations really use it to make some of these objective decisions. So you can see on the slide that criteria may include, but is not limited to, the impact of discontinuation, which is really thinking about the disease or condition under study is serious or life-threatening, and the research participant could be adversely impacted if access to the product were discontinued. Criteria could involve medical need. The investigational product addresses an unmet medical need in that no suitable therapeutic alternatives are available. Considerations of access or no access, meaning a physician cannot yet prescribe the product for the condition being studied. Research viability, that the provision of continued access to the product is not going to affect the viability of research or the ability to complete the trial or other trials. And then, of course, what we're going to hear about is a criteria of benefit or risk assessment, a positive overall study population benefit risk assessment based on data analysis from the first interpretable results or full study results. Okay, I am now going to turn back to Carla, and let's get back to our case. So, Carla, over to you.
Great. And do we have the next slide?
Yes, next slide.
Great. And so maybe before we jump into the what do we do now, you'll recall, so let's just take a step back on two things. One, you'll recall we ended up with a trial that did not end up meeting its primary endpoint, so did not satisfy the risk-benefit profile for that population, but we did have a subpopulation of responders. You'll recall that access varied across the globe. Different treatments may or may not be available. Typical medical practice is to keep people on something when they're benefiting and not move them due to the difficulties in managing the condition. You'll recall that the condition was not life-threatening, but definitely quality of life altering to not be well managed. So just a few reminders. And the other thing I want to make a mention of is maybe put my other hat on and put my bioethics hat on for a moment, is that when we, and this is maybe useful as we think of these things, when we think of post-trial access and the moral duty that we have, it's useful to remember there are some countries that have legal obligations, but in general, this is a company maybe tackling a difficult question of whether they should or have to, or what do our principles tell us? Because we have finite resources. Post-trial continued access is actually quite expensive. So you do want to be disciplined as you think about maybe there are trade-offs and there might be circumstances when it is appropriate. And the way we typically look through those is with, are we doing more harm than benefit? Are we being consistent and just and fair in the way we think of things and applying our principles similarly? And autonomy. And so this case, we actually told people that if benefit wasn't established or the benefit risk wasn't established, we weren't going to provide access, or that we only would be providing. So I don't know if the screen changed for you all, but I can't really see the text anymore. So one of the things that you might want to think about, or that I would ask the team is, were there safety issues? So it's one thing if you just didn't meet your primary endpoint and you didn't demonstrate efficacy, but did we actually pick up on something that's now unsafe, that we wouldn't want to keep somebody from maybe another treatment that's been demonstrated to be effective, but is actually unsafe. And so that's one, even for that population that benefited. What do the safety and efficacy profiles look like for the treatment alternatives? So even if you do have some safety concerns, sometimes you're trying to address those safety concerns of the available alternatives. So it could be almost a toss-up as to whether or not the safety is going to be better or worse. And it's really when you can get that investigator who's treating those individuals and can give some assessment of what that looks like, and if the trade-offs are really good for that particular individual. Another thing that can come into, especially when we start thinking about how long we might be offering these programs, in this particular case, it would be interesting to understand how long might we expect these patients to be stable. There's usually pretty good epidemiological data that talks about how long have people been stable on therapies, how often have they had to transition. And so that could be a helpful point to try to assess what kind of program you may or may not want to think about, again, for this subpopulation of responders who are benefiting. Another thing that we try to think about is when we were recruiting the trial, did somehow some inclusion-exclusion criteria we put into the protocol about related to prior treatment now affect what might be available to those individuals? This can also be a factor. So for example, if we had a requirement that a participant was to have tried the 3 available therapies on the market and that they did not work for them, that would allow a patient to enter the trial. So now you've got a little bit of a situation where even though there are 3 alternatives on the market, that patient has already demonstrated that they don't work for that patient. So that's an interesting calculus that you need to think about as well. And then you probably want to do a bit of a country by country assessment, depending on what the answers to some of these other questions were. So maybe in one particular region, all 7 therapies are available, or 5 or 6, and they're reimbursed and they're accessible. But in another country, maybe one's on the market, and maybe it's the one that's really old, doesn't have a great efficacy profile, and doesn't have a great safety profile. So often we then start to look at the country by country considerations to try to make an assessment as well. And importantly, what's the drug status, especially if this is a situation where this is a phase 3 registrational trial, you're gearing up to make decisions about manufacturing at a large scale, but you may be limited. And maybe this primary endpoint was the key decision point in whether or not this program was going to continue. And now there's not going to be resources put toward this because in general, this is not going to serve a broader population. So now you're looking at, okay, do we keep manufacturing for how many patients do we keep manufacturing for? How many available clinical supplies might we be able to use? Are those going to be acceptable in certain regions to meet these needs? So even though it might seem like when you see this subpopulation that's benefited, a little bit of a knee-jerk reaction to go, well, of course we'll go ahead and take care of that group. There are a lot of really interesting questions that can go into whether it's even appropriate or possible to actually do that. Maybe I'll go to Ben first. Anything that you want to add or thoughts, and then I'll just plant the seed with Brendy that I'm going to come to her next, because while this all may make sense from a company perspective, I think it's really important to imagine how this might land with the individuals themselves. But first, Ben, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Carla. A couple of other things that came to mind while you were talking about this is they're all scenario based, right? And there are things that we look at in each of these situations. One, and we didn't talk about it here, but we talk about it in the different principles and in the frameworks, is it's possible that you established a pre-specified time limit for providing post-trial access at the onset of the trial, when patients consented, and in the protocols. There are situations where you may say you're going to, as a sponsor, only provide access for 5 years after the end of the trial. And that helps with the drug supply status, because you can plan for it. You can know that it's going to be available for that time period. But it would be trumped or replaced if there was a safety issue. Obviously, there are reasons why you would potentially stop that earlier than that time period. Others may be country mechanisms. We've mentioned a few times, depending upon what country you're in. What country you're in makes a big difference. It can be because of the legal aspect of things. It can also be because of the mechanism that you're using. And some mechanisms are less resource burden for the sponsor, for the investigators and the sites. And so, would you be able to switch the mechanism in order to potentially keep it going a little bit longer, or did you establish that from the beginning as well? And then the third one that came to mind is we talk about if this is the phase 3 trial for approval, but potentially this is a phase 3 trial for a line extension. And are there mechanisms in place in different countries where you can make availability and accessibility? And I know we've talked a lot of times in these slides about availability, but accessibility is a key aspect too. And especially when you're thinking about suitable alternative treatments that may be available, they also need to be accessible for patients, meaning in most cases reimbursed at the country level. And so that's something that we also look at and take into account.
Thanks so much, Ben. Yeah, really terrific points, especially some of them around duration and setting those expectations up front in the country analysis. Brandy, over to you, please. Would love to get your reaction. And just for a moment, would like to echo Sarah's appreciation, because I think while we were going through these exercises, having your perspective on some of these really specific scenarios was so incredibly helpful.
Thank you. Yes. And Ben, as always, appreciate your focus on there is a distinction between availability and accessibility, and that is on a patient by patient um, level. So I think the fundamental part of this is always asking, is the patient represented in the decisions that you're making? Is um, is there a plan for ongoing care? Like, are there actual providers who are able and willing to provide support? Are they near the patient? Um, there are situations where patients can lose their own providers simply because they're unwilling or unable to deal with the burden that this additional, treatment burden may come with. So when you're determining or planning for how these decisions will be made, also factor in who is making those decisions. Is there agency for the patient to be able to let you know what will and will not work for them in their individual circumstances, and understand that they, as an individual, um, are far more than just their participation in your research. So, making sure that they are represented in the decision-making process from the very beginning. I'm a huge advocate for involving patients and lived experience in the design. Like, don't wait till the end. Begin getting the perspectives and the questions very early, because they'll help you find where it's likely to fall down, because we've all been through that process.
I think that's the individual aspect, and thinking about that is really important. And one thing in the burden, one thing we've often also talked about, especially as we're seeing an increased number of hybrid approaches to continued access. So you could have a single trial that may have some participants continuing as patients in the trial because there is no local legal pathway to facilitate post-trial access. And then you also have individuals who use that local legal pathway. And there are different burdens on the physicians and on the individual. And, if you remove them or you choose a pathway that is not in the clinical trial, does that affect the care they're able to get through that other pathway? So there are some interesting points. I think you're right about, can we make sure that we have a good understanding of that as we're making some of these decisions up front to say, yes, this is going to be a hybrid trial or not. What are those other patient considers and burden considerations as well? Ben, back to you. Anything that you wanted to add before we maybe think about seeing if there's some questions from folks or further expanding on maybe some additional concepts?
No, I do see a question in the Q&A, and I think we've bounced and touched around it a little bit, but the question is, I am curious to understand further about research viability in the context that sometimes the trial, especially open label extension studies open for provision of post-trial access, need to be kept open for a long time till availability. Does this come under research viability assessment? And I think that we've talked about there's different hybrid mechanisms. You can actually transition to a different mechanism along the way, and consider what is it that you're going to do. Oftentimes that transition will occur either if you have multiple trials in a program and you're going to move them into a rollover or into a master protocol with sub-studies, depending upon how everything is progressing there. Or if you are to a situation like we talked about in our scenario where you are having fewer and fewer patients continue, you may transition to some other mechanisms such as individual patient access. If you had the open label extension done before. Open label extensions are great opportunities to make it simple, but they're the most expensive version there is. And so it's not always the best choice. And it depends upon really the overall research design. And I try to have this conversation at my company as much as possible to remember that If an open label extension is in place because you have a research need, then that's not post-trial access. That's you're answering a regulatory or research question. So don't call it that because you need to treat it as truly a research type of activity. Post-trial access does not have the same level of rigor necessary, and you shouldn't apply the same level of rigor because it puts too much burden on the entire research enterprise.
I think that's a really important point, and thank you to Subhashini for the question, because I've seen good practice in where teams think about what potential post-trial commitments might there be. There could be regulatory commitments that require an extension trial. There could be the moral sort of obligation for continued access that create that evidence generation needs, safety, long-term safety follow-up. So really thinking in a disciplined way. So to answer your question specifically, absolutely, it should affect the assessment of the research viability, the design of the clinical trial, the agreements on the funding and the resources to actually support that, because it has to be considered. So if you make that upfront assessment that yes, continued access is going to be part of that responsibility, then you need to build in, like Ben was saying, how are you going to do that? How much is it going to cost? What is your clinical trial footprint? Are you in countries that have a legal pathway that won't need a clinical trial? Are you going to have an extension for a period of time to meet your evidentiary needs? And then you're going to transition over into a light trial and or local pathways. So all of these, just like Ben would say, all of these are things that we've been working on getting teams to think about in advance to really form a holistic perspective, so they, to Brandy's point, can be very clear with in the protocol, in the informed consent form, so that individuals know what to expect at the various different milestones of the trial and what they're experiencing. So definitely best practice to include that assessment in the research viability and the design of the trial. So let me check in really quick with Sarah. We've got about 18 minutes yet. Do you want to go? I think we've also now got another question. Oh, no, just
just a statement. I have a few questions for you all. And I think as the audience is probably heard, Carla and Ben are very experienced and very well versed with different mechanisms, different country standards. And Eli Lilly and Johnson & Johnson have had policies in place and had, many instances where you've been able to really push and pressure test how you're going to do this. If you're a new organization that is actually doesn't have policy and trying to figure this out, I wonder if you can just offer, what is it that these organizations should really think about in terms of getting started with a policy, who to involve in the organization, and then also thinking about understanding all of the different countries and mechanisms and how this works. So maybe that's a very big question. So don't feel obliged to bite it all off, but maybe
I'll jump in, Ben. I'll start maybe from the policy side, and then you can maybe think about implementation. So I think when we were first working on our policy back, oh wow, it's been a while now, several years ago. Not to shamelessly plug the work that we've just done and have been doing, but our company used the framework from Harvard MRCT as a starting point to say, because it gives the flexibility of asking questions and thinking about considerations without dictating what you should do as a company, but it gives you the questions to ask. So that would be my first suggestion, is if you've never looked at the materials, never thought about the principles, take a look at the toolkit, because that will at least start you on the path to thinking about the right questions to ask. And then I think from a policy setting perspective, the impacts are going to be on clinical trial budgets and the teams that own those budgets, and really thinking about clinical trial design. And then also, depending on what you call it in your particular organization, there may be a managed access function or an organization that takes care of things like pre-approval access, post-trial access, that do those local legal pathways. So even though those are more operational pieces, they're critical to understand the kind of policy you're putting in place. general governance bodies. So most companies have some type of body that is looking at decisions around milestones and how trials progress, so that type of input as well. And of course, absolutely critical are legal colleagues to really help you understand how you're shaping that. I'm probably missing some really critical stakeholders, but having that lens of, is your policy going to be feasible? So from an operations perspective, are you complying with relevant laws that are required? And then who are those other stakeholders who sort of hold the purse strings or are going to be impacted by things you say, like you have to do it for 3 to 5 years? Who's going to pay for that? And if it's not you setting that up as the policy, which it usually isn't, who's going to have that say? But Ben, maybe over to you to talk a little bit more about some of those other.
Yeah, I think every company has different groups that are called different things, but I think Carla, you nailed it from the overall aspect of it. It's a multifunctional responsibility. The only group that I feel like we need to make sure we call out specifically is your clinical supply team, because you're going to definitely need to know how much material you will potentially need, knowing that manufacturing, labeling, and getting the material ready is not a overnight task. And so you definitely need to think about that, especially if it's medicine that people will continue to take over time. And I do think the other the other big group that you're going to need to make sure that you're including is your transition to commercial material, transition to supply. What is that going to look like? So, we've talked a lot, Sarah said before, we've had a big framework around the if. The if is the first piece that you got to deal with, and then the how you're going to do it is the second piece. And that how is going to include how you're going to provide it and how you're going to transition. And so thinking about how to do that. I'm sorry, I got distracted because there are a couple of questions that came in. So I just wanted to make sure that I said that. And then
I was going to say,
think
do you want to stay on the operationalizing one? I mean, the operation, so the person asked about, can you comment on operationalizing? Anything you want to expand on or add there?
Yeah, I think from an operationalizing aspect, planning early is very, very important. We've talked about that. If you're going to provide it, obviously needs to be discussed before you even start the trial, because you should allow patients to consent. And the protocol is required per the Declaration of Helsinki to talk about whether you're going to provide post-trial access. Remember, there are situations where you will not provide post-trial access, and it's as important to say that in the protocol and in the informed consent. Yeah. So the patients and the investigators and the ERBs, IRBs are all aware that it's okay. You just need to make sure that you're explaining that. And then then you get to the how, and the operationalizing it really does get to, what does your overall development program look like, and in what countries are you doing your development program? And I can't emphasize enough that country selection makes a difference. It's not the reason to pick a country. It is because of the post-trial access aspect of things, but you do need to know what are the different options in those countries, and what are the potential legal requirements.
And maybe I'll add one thing, and then I'll invite Brandy to maybe comment on any of the questions we've been addressing if she wants to. We found and that templated language in the protocol template, the informed consent form, and the clinical trial agreement with the site really helps. We're working on it, so we're trying to make sure that it's standardized, but having that consistent across the different programs and negotiating that agreement up front with the various, in our case, therapeutic areas, to make sure that everybody agrees on the way we're framing the options for including in those documents has been really important. So getting that organizational alignment avoids having sort of a myriad of different scenarios, and really getting clarity on that. But while we look at the next question, Brandy, anything in particular that you want to make sure you can comment on?
Yeah, and Brandy, can I jump in? Because
Yes.
I'm glad Carla went in that direction, because I also wanted to prompt you to additionally reflect on, as a participant, what is helpful to see in the consent form, what is helpful to be told as a patient, which I think are incredibly important pieces for anyone on this call today.
Yes, the one thing that I wanted to draw attention to is while there's always an appropriate amount of focus on the actual initial consent document, consent is ongoing. This is never a situation where it should be just handled at the beginning and never spoken of again, right? Like there need to be reminders. Sarah can attest is, a couple of years ago, I went back and pulled my original consent document. And what I thought that said, what I thought I had agreed to, and when I actually went back and read it, not the same thing. So our memories are fallible. And, my understanding, looking back, is it's good to have that document, but it's also good to have repeated ongoing conversations about how a participant's development through a trial impacts the that what was in that consent. So, when you determine that a patient is responding or is not responding, having that conversation of, if we go back to that consent, you are now, not eligible for continue access because you did not respond. But like having those points of conversation are important. Consent should always be continuing to happen, and how their future post-trial access is impacted by the developments within the trial, not just things that the patient may not know about, but also how their own participation in the trial is impacted. Those are pretty critical milestones to keep in mind for understanding that the patient isn't necessarily going to go back and read a document.
Great. Super helpful reminders. And I, if we could just have the t-shirts made that say informed consent isn't a form, it's a process, I'd be super happy. Maybe we need to have some merch on the side. We've got a question, PTA in the US for a new indication that will not be moving forward for approval. Drug is approved in the US for another indication since it can be prescribed off label, wondering about accessibility side. That's a really interesting question. So I'm going to focus on the PTA part of it. So I think it would be, why is it not moving forward for approval in the US? So you might, I guess there could be a company decision that they didn't want to file. That would be an interesting one. Oh, it went away. Hang on. If there are safety issues, so there are examples where you've had a product that it is safe and effective for a particular indication, but when you explore it in a different population, maybe you had unreasonable safety concerns about that particular population. So as a pharmaceutical manufacturer, you're not permitted to promote off-label use of the product. So you'd have to be very mindful of how you handled that particular case. So again, I think this goes a little bit to our foundational sort of criteria that we talked about. What's the impact of the discontinuation? What's the medical need? Are there concerns with a company continuing to provide it, especially if a doc can provide it off label, if they feel really strongly that it benefited their patients and they want to prescribe it off label? That could be appropriate, but it could be inappropriate for the company to participate in that. So I think that it's an interesting conundrum that would have to be assessed on a factual basis about what the circumstances were. Ben, am I missing anything there, like from an operations side? The U.S. is tricky in this
there's
area.
a couple of things too. Again, that constant reassessment of, is there a suitable alternative treatment? Is the reason why the company is not moving forward because the availability landscape has changed so that something else was first to market and is now the standard of care, and it is an appropriate thing to transition patients to at the consideration of the investigator. The other thing is that there are mechanisms that may be available for you as a company to utilize that are outside of the clinical trial space, and that deal with reimbursement for a specific product for a specific patient who is still really receiving the medicine because they were a participant in a clinical trial, and in the opinion of the investigator and the patient, they are still experiencing benefit and there is no suitable alternative treatment for them. So
On
it's
that point,
definitely.
Ben, just to jump in, to be explicit, the FDA has said in written statements and remarks that in those limited cases, at times the
Yeah.
expanded access legal pathway could be used. But again, to Ben's point, it's very dependent on, is it life threatening? Are there other alternatives? What does the real
Right.
scenario look like? So that expanded access pathway is very limited in the US for post trial access. But they have
Mhm.
talked about the fact that a manufacturer shouldn't use it as an excuse not to assess it in case it does fit those criteria.
Right. And that's true in the US. I will also expand to say that there are other countries that have other mechanisms that are available. Australia and is an example of one, that you may consider. We've had experiences in Spain and in other places where we're able to use commercial material specifically for patients who participate in a trial. So it's not off-label prescribing and promotion, but it's just the provision of the medicine for a patient who is experiencing benefit from a clinical trial.
I would just like to very quickly interject in the premise of a US patient for off-label is who's going to find the provider that will issue that off-label? Because as a patient, I am unable to call up a directory of providers and ask them before booking an appointment, hey, will you write this drug? They
And
it
the
we
company can't help you
Yeah,
because they'd
no,
be
they
promoting
No.
cannot.
off-label
Exactly.
use.
So, and is the commitment to continue providing off-label, going to go forward? So just because something is theoretically available for off-label use does not mean that that is something that the patient can actually um, secure on their own without sometimes, being viewed negatively in asking things for a specific way. So please consider that.
I'm glad you brought that up because it also is a driver of some important discussions that have been had that we even talked about in our working group around second indication. So exactly the situation when something's approved and then something is approved on the market and you're in that gap, there could be circumstances. Sarah, we've got one last question. Do you want me to hold and answer that in writing and let you go into your close, or how would you like us to manage our last 3 minutes?
Uh, so that's a really tricky question, right? We could spend a lot of time on that. So maybe we answer that in writing, and if we don't get it completely out, we can answer it, as part of the materials that go out to everyone. And I also see now an additional one. So maybe we stop with the Q&A, we pull the slides back up, and we'll answer those two questions offline. And if Kristen, if you just want to okay, okay. This was a great discussion, and I think this group on the call today, we decided to do a little bit less talking at and more talking with, because you can see how one case is one case and how what different directions different studies and different situations can go in. So I really appreciate all of you engaging in that kind of think and conversation. And I hope the audience really enjoyed that. We have a couple other upcoming things that the MRCT Center really wants you all to know about. In a couple weeks, we have a artificial intelligence, digital twins, and synthetic data webinar. You can see the advertisement here. I think someone is going to drop that registration into the link, drop the registration into the chat. And then if we go to the next slide, um, the MRCT Center has a pretty broad portfolio of work, and we really like to showcase that work and emerging conversations at our annual symposium. This year's symposium is just a little over a month away, so we'd love for you all to register. The link has just been dropped in there. It's both in-person and virtual registration too. So we hope we can see many of you at that annual symposium. I know Carla and Ben will be there, and I hope Brandy will at least be there virtually actually, no, Brandy is not going to be there because she's got a big birthday and she has better plans in Spain. But anyway, next slide. And just to say thank you to Brandy, to Ben, and Carla, today for this really amazing conversation. And thank you for all for joining, and the materials will be forthcoming. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.